Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 2020 Audit Committee Chairs Forum today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend my respect to the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are present today. My name is Roberta Skliros and I've recently been appointed as Assistant Auditor-General of Financial Audit at Vargo. It goes without saying that the last few months have been challenging for all of us in our professional and personal lives. So today we thought we'd use this opportunity to highlight all implications of the pandemic through 4 different areas. The first session being the audit response, new risks and approaches, presented by Andrew Greaves, the Auditor-General. A lens on IT security and resilience by John O'Driscoll, Chief Information Security Officer for the Victorian State Government. Business continuity, lessons learned by our Deputy Auditor-General, Dave Barry, and then I'll touch on some financial reporting implications. During the session, you can interact by posting questions, supporting others' questions by the thumbs up icon, and also there'll be a Q&A session at the end of each presentation and at the end of the forum. So to that end, I'll hand over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Roberta. Welcome everybody, I hope you're well, and I hope today we'll be able to share some useful insights with you. It goes without saying that a lot's changed in a very short space of time, and flattening the curves kind of entered our lexicon, and that's not a bad thing, but the other concepts like COVID kilos and isoholic, maybe less desirable, have also entered the lexicon. So what's changed? Well, we're all experiencing that working from home now has become the norm, and we're talking about this being the new norm. We're not really sure what's going to happen out the other side of this, but we're looking forward to a better norm. There's obviously been some impacts on our reporting timelines under the Financial Management Act as agencies are challenged, and we've had the budget pushed out into the next financial year. And of course, the government itself, in responding to this emergency, has put aside an extra $24.5 billion in emergency funding. We've also seen changes in the way that we're being governed at the moment, and here's this kind of a summary of the key governance mechanisms that are now in place during this crisis, and many of you will be aware of these, particularly in state government, and I'm sure at local government there have been similar changes in structures and governance arrangements. So we ask ourselves, we've got a large part of our public sector workforce based at home. We've had disruption to our normal governance and budgetary and reporting processes, and we've experiencing rapid and large scale urgent and unforeseen expenditures. What could go wrong? I ask you, I hear you ask. Well, I'll start with what did go wrong, and I've got a case study here, and it was a response to the Ebola outbreak in 14-15 in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and the 2 Supreme Audit Officers over in those countries undertook some audits during the crisis and post-crisis. And here's an outline of the types of things they covered. You might be thinking, well, you know, we're a first world country, they're a developing country, so we're worlds apart. How could this be of relevance to us? But I'd suggest my experience is that we're not immune to the risks and to the issues that were identified through those audits. What we found, or what they found when they looked at the response, non-adherence to procurement procedures in particular, because there was a lot of rapid procurement and weak quality control systems. And this led to a range of issues as outlined on the slides there. I suspect that in the Australian context and even in the Victorian context, we might find similar things, or at least there is the risk that these things could happen. Now, the Australian Audit Office also thinks there's some risks that these things could happen. And most recently on their website, they've put up an Audit Insights, which kind of goes through all the audits they've done over the last decade or so that have looked at times of rapid implementation of Australian government initiatives. So I draw that to your attention. It's quite a useful read. And I've got highlighted on the screen one of the key learnings, if you like. From that, the guide actually sets out about 9 key learnings. This one goes to maintaining active budget oversight and financial management. And I guess if I look at what the ANO says, when they basically contextualise this and say that when we're rapidly implementing significant change, we generally require entities to draw on a full range of their human, physical and ICT resources to enable them, and I'm sure that's been the case here in Victoria, and also using external resources. And early on in these situations, there's quite often a misalignment between the resources and the resource needs at the rollout stage, and that in itself creates significant risks. And the resources, in fact, can be a constraint, and I'll come to some of those constraints a little bit later. So again, I draw your attention to that publication. I think it's only a short read, but it's got some really useful and powerful lessons in it for us all. And it speaks in kind of an underlying sense to internal control. Now, as audit committee chairs and members of audit committees, one of your main functions, of course, is to oversight the system of internal control in your organisations. And we'd all be familiar, I'd suggest, with the COSO framework, the 5 elements of internal control, the control environment being the thing that underpins all the other aspects of control. And we also have monitoring and review, information systems, communication, control activities, and of course risk management. And I've got on the screen at the moment kind of the key elements of the control environment. Now, in normal circumstances, we're all minded to examine these variously through our internal audit work and through our conversations with management. And I just thought in this particular setting today, with the emergency unfolding, there's probably some red flags we should be looking out for. This is not to say that these things exist, but I'd be asking questions of management, internal audit and external audit as to whether or not any of these things do exist, because these things impinge on the control environment. I've seen a lot of conversation over the last 6 to 7 weeks about the impact of people working remotely on their morale, and that can lead to diminishing their motivation to actually carry out their procedures as they should and contribute to the organisation. I'm also minded that sometimes when we get into these emergency situations, attitudes can start prevailing about pushing through and can do and must do. I experienced that in another jurisdiction where I was Auditor-General, this can do mantra, which in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be misinterpreted and it can be misunderstood, and that people then start thinking that the ends are the thing that we focus on, and that we go through any means to get to those ends. So it'd be interesting to get a reading on the culture of the organisations. Of course, these crisis structures, and I've mentioned the new structures earlier on in the slide pack, can blur accountability because we're moving away from our normal assignment of authority and responsibility and replacing them with potentially temporary structures or even sometimes permanent structures. So we should be understanding how these structures operate and how authority has been assigned with responsibility. Allied to that, of course, I'd be worried if we had too much concentration of authority through those structures, and equally I'd be worried if there was too much dilution of authority. And the last feature that impacts on our control environment, of course, is the competency and capability of our workforces, be our permanent workforce or our contingent workforces. And in some organisations, there's been a rapid change in the size of the workforce, generally up in responding to the crisis, but sometimes down. And of course, we've had a lot of people redeployed into unfamiliar roles to be able to respond. So they'd be the kind of checklists that I'd be going through as an audit committee member with management, as I said, as it relates to the control environment. If I looked at one of the other elements, monitoring and review, internal audit's such a key part of the control framework of an organisation. And even there, I'd be concerned with a series of red flags. If internal audit programs were ceased or deferred, and I guess the point I'd make there is that, in my estimation, internal audit probably is more valuable now than ever, because it gives you an opportunity to have them kind of examine these programs in flight, look at the design of the programs and the setup of the program. But that may mean, of course, that the current internal audit program is now outdated and is misaligned to new risks. So it'd be timely for committee members and chairs to have a look at the approved internal audit plan and reevaluate whether or not it remains appropriate. There's always a risk as well that internal audit resources and these other resources that monitor the other parts of the organisations get diverted away from their work and into frontline delivery. And that may be an appropriate response in organisations, but of course that then creates the risk of these functions being compromised in terms of their independence, because they now get involved in line delivery, and it'll be hard for them then to go back later on and independently review how effective that was. Information and communication systems, another component of the control environment. There's a couple of issues I'm interested in here. One of them is kind of a financial audit bent, if you like, and I'm sure Roberta will touch on this when she speaks about financial reporting and accounting issues. We're always worried when there's a significant downturn in revenue for those agencies that rely on revenues, and of course that focuses our attention down onto local government in particular, on their own sourced revenues, because then that creates new risks and new incentives potentially to manipulate financial reports. And of course the significant disruption of services that goes along with that. We come back to the state government level, where the state government reports on its service performance, and there could be some motivation to manipulate the reporting of service performance. Of course, underpinning the financial reporting is record keeping. And there's this need to make sure we get this balance. We've got to set a minimum standard of appropriate record keeping in times of crisis. What worries me is that these housekeeping activities fall by the by, and we don't ever recover and restore a good audit trail, and I've seen instances where things like audit logs are inactivated or are inactive in the first place. So there's very little chance of being able to re-establish what happened and who approved what and when. So just be mindful of that. The control activities, the things that operate over the transactions and balances. I've already seen and already heard some reports of these control activities being circumvented in the context of the need to pay vendors in a week. I think there was a kind of direction came out that in responding to the crisis and the economic impact on the private sector, there was a direction from the state government to pay vendors quickly. That's a great thing for vendors, but we don't want to lose appropriate control over that. And some of the things you get worried about as you're redeploying staff, or you're losing staff, or you've gone to remote arrangements, is that the segregation of duties you'd ordinarily have in place no longer operates. So that excessive concentration of authority that I spoke about in the control environment. The other red flag, of course, is that we set up our systems of control generally for routine transactions, and suddenly we're now experiencing a lot of non-routine transactions. We're finding revenue systems where we're refunding revenue much more significantly than we're earning the revenue, and these are quite material. And the huge transaction volumes, this rapidity, this need to ramp up payments and get them out the door, increasing transaction volumes, all these things combined with compressed processing timelines, just increase the risk that the controls won't operate. Now, we remember the controls are set up there for three reasons. We have our controls to make sure we have efficient and effective operations. We have controls to make sure we comply with legislation and regulations, and we have controls to make sure that we report reliably. And it's the control activities that are the focus of those three objectives. So they're the areas I'd be focused on there. Lastly, the last element, of course, is risk management. And I've already mentioned that risks may change and we need to keep updating our risk registers. But what worries me is that, coming back to issues of culture and attitude and push through and can do, is that we might have spent a lot of time defining our risk tolerance as an organisation, but at times like this, these tolerances can be relaxed. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if that's defined and managed, but if they're informally relaxed, if people start taking an attitude that I'm allowed to take risks, I'm permitted and authorised to take risks because of the urgency, that's not necessarily a good thing. As I said, we probably need to make sure that our risk registers are now up to date, that no new risks have emerged that we haven't got under control, and we need to look at the risk treatments on our existing risks. Are they still appropriate, given what might have happened to the likelihood or the significance of those existing risks? So they were areas of internal control that I was worried about, which go back to making sure that we don't waste money and spend money inappropriately. The last resource I'll take you to is something that the New South Wales ICAC has put out recently about how to manage corrupt conduct during COVID-19. Of course, this has lessons in it for whether it's COVID-19 or just generally, but the point that the New South Wales ICAC makes is that at times like this, motivation from internal parties and external parties increases. If there's a significant economic downturn, those that are affected by that may be more motivated to try and participate in corrupt and fraudulent conduct. And of course, given the conversation I've just had about the changes to your internal control structures, there could be greater opportunity. I like their, they talk about precipitating workarounds, and it sounds very euphemistically, and I looked into the document and they describe workarounds as inventive ways to breach procedures or exploit loopholes. So I guess that's saying it in a very plain way. So where do we worry in terms of fraud and corruption risk? Some of these things are related to the control structure I spoke about earlier. People working from home, loss of contact with staff, disengagement of staff, this morale motivation issue. The ICAC points out to the fact that people are going to be working now in open, unsecure workspaces. I'm sitting in my lounge room at the moment. So there's a risk there that people might see what's on my screen when they shouldn't see what's on my screen. They interestingly flagged social media posts, and the point there was that people might be posting on social media in terms of their current working environment and inadvertently disclose information through the social media post, something in the background, for example, and concerns about like, well, how do we manage electronic signatures and approvals? I've had to grapple with that in signing warrants for the government to draw down their appropriation. We were always on a manual signature process, and now we've had to move to an electronic signature process. Procurement red flags worry me at this time. As I said, we're accelerating terms of trade. There may be a tendency to now go to direct engagement of suppliers rather than go through a competitive process. Allied with that, then people may start to overuse exemptions, and there may be increased use of credit cards. Now, all of these are appropriate responses, but they can mask and cover fraudulent activity. So again, as an audit committee chair, a member of an audit committee, I think it'd be worthwhile inquiring of management whether or not these things exist. And I'm not going to steal John O'Driscoll's thunder, but IT security, is it secret, is it safe? We've seen at the state government level at least, and I believe at some local governments, the rapid deployment of the virtual private networks to enable people to work remotely. And of course, allied with that is that last point, single factor authentication. What level of authentication do you have for people working remotely and attaching their endpoint devices? So how well managed is the endpoint security? And the last one there, the second dot point of some concern to me is whether or not there's been a need or a perceived need for organisations to create more admin roles, more super user admin roles to enable this. And in and of itself, again, that may have been required, but carefully managing and controlling that access and removing that access as soon as possible would be one way to respond to those risks. So just to finalise, I thought I'd take you through our thinking, and if you read The Age yesterday, you might have seen, or it might have been the day before now, the opposition leader demanding that we undertake an audit of COVID-19 expenditures. Well, in fact, we've already had that planned, and we've already spoken to the Public Accounts Committee about doing that audit. As an aside, it was good to see I've been awarded an honorary doctorate. If you read the article, I'm not a doctor, but it was good to be awarded one. So these are the performance audits that we'll be undertaking over the next 6 to 9 months. The first one's a review engagement, the drawdown of the Treasurer's advance. And of course, something we're all vitally interested in now is how well did our business continuity arrangements stand up? How well did they operate? And what lessons can we learn? And what do we need to change in terms of our business continuity going forward? Financial audit program. Because internal control has been impacted, no doubt, my auditors will need to do more what we call substantive work. So that just means shifting away from controls reliance to directly looking at the transactions and balances themselves. I saw before the session started, someone had already asked a question about whether or not timeframes would be affected, and we can come back to that in the Q&A. For the moment, we've agreed with Treasury and Finance and Premier and Cabinet that our focus should be on the material entities that contribute to the state's financial statements. So this is for state government now. Local government we treat separately, and we're talking to the local government entities about their timeframes. But for state government entities, we're focused on material entities so that the state can continue to produce an annual financial report, which is what we'd expect. And we're working with the immaterial agencies and looking at those who may be seeking relief and extension. And the last bit of news, I guess, is that we, as part of our contribution, if you like, made a decision that we'd freeze our fee rates at our 18-19 rates for the 19-20 audits. And what that means is we won't be increasing the fee, provided we don't have to change the scope of our audit. Of course, if we have to do more work, then we have to do more work, but we'll do it at the fee rate that we had at 18-19. Right, that was a quick walk through. I hope those references I've given you find useful. I commend them to you. There's plenty of stuff out there on the internet. And through my trolling through it, I thought they were the ones that really stood out for me. So now we're moving over to the Q&A. So I'm quite happy now to take any questions. Roberta, I wonder if there are any for me at the moment.
Yes, there are a few here, Andrew. The first one is regarding will the year-end audit be delayed?
Yeah, thanks, Roberta. Well, you may be better placed to answer that, given that you are now the Assistant Auditor-General Financial Auditor. Can I throw that one back to you? Is that possible?
You can, and I'll actually be addressing that in my presentation later on in the session. So, but just to echo the comments you've made, Andrew, we've been working with the Department of Treasury and Finance and DPC on looking at financial reporting timelines and what our primary and secondary focuses are. And we're working through some of those challenges at the moment, so I'll talk through that a little bit later. The next question I have here, Andrew, is will VAGO or service providers still attend audit committee meetings in person when those meetings are held face to face?
Yeah, look, and I'm sure Dave will touch on this as well, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but we've taken the view in my organisation that I guess the precautionary principle prevails for us, the health and well-being of our staff, and of course the staff of our auditees is uppermost in our minds. So in fact we sent our staff home a week before everyone else did, and no doubt Dave will take you through what our thinking was there. And now that we have this directive that if you can work from home, you must work from home, it's no longer an option. Our view is that we're walking up very slowly to the idea of face-to-face meetings. It's this type of technology through Teams. We certainly want to be at audit committee meetings, but we think we should be able to be enabled to be at audit committee meetings through this technology or Zoom or whatever technology it is, Skype, that our clients have. So the short answer is absolutely we want to keep attending audit committee meetings. We'll be talking to each agency about their approach to their staff returning to work and their approach then to people who aren't their staff coming into their workplace. And we'll be mindful of their approaches, and we certainly won't be imposing ourselves on people's workplaces if they don't want anyone there. But even if they're happy to accept us at their workplace, we'll still be requiring an understanding of what protections there'll be for our own staff who are attending those workplaces so that we minimise any health risks associated with the crisis.